People no longer bound by their non-disclosure agreements. What secret can you now disclose? Story 1. This didn't happen to me, but to my cousin. He landed his first job in marketing at one of the top firms in the country. My cousin is ridiculously good looking. He used to be a model for Abercrombie and Fitch, not just at the local store level, but as a national model. He also dresses well, which definitely made him stand out. Not long after starting the job, his boss's boss, a male executive, began hitting on him excessively. It started with frequent invitations, lunch, dinner, even weekends at the executive's home. My cousin repeatedly turned him down. Things escalated when, during a car ride, the executive blatantly implied that my cousin would advance quickly if he spent the weekend with him. Luckily, my cousin recorded the entire conversation. He continued to reject the advances and ghosted the executive's invitations for weeks until the man finally stopped. Fast forward 3 months into the job. He was called in for a performance review with HR and his immediate supervisor. Suddenly, he was being told that he wasn't a good fit, wasn't a team player, and ultimately, they were terminating his employment. Instead of signing the termination paperwork, he took it, put it in his pocket, and then pulled out his phone. He played the recording. When it ended, he looked directly at the HR manager and asked if she had anything to say. Both she and his supervisor left the room in complete shock. He waited in the conference room for about an hour before the HR manager returned, now with her superior on the conference line. They immediately started lecturing him about how it was illegal to record private conversations and how they could press charges. He laughed and reminded them that the press would love this story and that he'd be more than happy to go on TV. 3 days later, he was signing a non-disclosure agreement and picking up a check, one big enough to cover almost 3 years of law school. And for those wondering, no, the executive who harassed him was never fired. In fact, he's since been promoted. Story 2. My best friend used to work at a roadside attraction near Chattanooga, Tennessee, called Ruby Falls, not to be confused with other places of the same name. It's marketed as a waterfall inside a cave. But here's the thing. It's not as natural as they make it seem. The trail leading to the cave has been completely redone with imported rocks from around the world. And while they've admitted to that part, the waterfall itself is another story. Naturally, it's barely a trickle, and that's only during the wetter seasons. What people don't know is that they've run a hidden pipe up there, supplementing the falls with municipal water. It's powered by a pump placed off to the side, cleverly concealed so that visitors can't hear it over the sound of water crashing down from 100 feet above. But here's the real kicker. The place is old, with electrical wiring dating back to the Great Depression and the whole setup being 300 feet underground. Power outages happen. And when they do, the first rule in the falls room is to evacuate everyone immediately, not for safety, but because without the artificial pump running, the illusion is shattered. Story 3. This isn't an NDA, it's a secrecy agreement with the Department of Defense that expired after 25 years. I worked as a programmer for the U.S. Air Force from 1979 to early 1981, handling the global USF budget. This was during a unique political window. Reagan was becoming a strong presidential candidate, but Carter was still in office as a lame duck president. Many senior officers in the Air Force absolutely despised Carter. At the time, the USF had flown the B-1, not the later B-1A or B-1B, just the original B-1. Many high-ranking officials had dedicated years of their careers to this program, fully believing in it as a top-tier, strategic, long-range supersonic bomber. But Carter hated the B-1. He saw it as a bloated, wasteful project designed to keep defense contractors afloat at taxpayers' expense. So, in 1977, he canceled it. However, a few prototypes still existed, though they were never meant for service. Reagan, on the other hand, loved the B-1. It was everything he admired in military programs, fast, high-tech, and superior to anything the Soviets had. Here's where things get interesting. Carter gave explicit orders. The only 2 flying B-1s were to be dismantled. The project was to be completely shut down. All engineering materials were to be archived at the Pentagon, and all funding was to be cut. He even demanded photographic proof of the aircraft being destroyed. But Reagan caught wind of this order and sent his own message. Under no circumstances was Carter's directive to be followed. Now, my job at the time was simply budget analysis, but I had top secret clearance because I worked with financial allocations tied to classified projects. One day, I noticed a massive new expenditure linked to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It wasn't in any approved or pending project lists, meaning it hadn't been reviewed by Congress. Yet the funds were actively being dispersed. Assuming it was a mistake, I brought it to my boss's attention. He agreed, and we reversed the transaction. 2 days later, chaos erupted. A general stormed into our office, furious, demanding to know who had cut his funding. That's when we were pulled into a classified meeting, sworn to secrecy, and ordered to reinstate the maintenance project. The truth? That project was a cover to secretly disassemble one of the B-1s, swap out parts with scrap from other aircraft, stage a fake destruction process, photograph it, and send the pictures to Carter. Meanwhile, the real aircraft was quietly reassembled and hidden inside a black hangar. That's why, within days of Reagan taking office, the B-1 program was fully back online. Story 4. That married grocery store manager in his late 40s? Yeah, he was absolutely having an affair with the 17-year-old courtesy clerk in the compressor room. This was over 15 years ago when I was a person in charge, PIC, not yet a full assistant store manager. Our store had a couple of rooms upstairs in the back, one for electrical breakers and backup generators, and another housing compressors that powered the freezers and coolers. Both were locked at all times for security reasons, only accessible through the back room. The 17-year-old courtesy clerk had been working there for a while. She wasn't the best employee. She had a habit of disappearing for 30 minutes to an hour at a time. We complained and tried disciplining her, but the store manager always blocked it. She was, let's just say, an attractive blonde. One night, I was in charge when an alarm went off, indicating one of the compressors was running low. It was my responsibility to check the levels and report the issue. When I went upstairs, I noticed the compressor room door was propped open with a bucket. I assumed someone had left it that way. If you've never been inside a compressor room, let me tell you, it is loud. Our store had multiple diesel engines powering the compressors, making it impossible to hear anything over the noise. I walked toward the back, turned a corner, and saw her, not fully clothed, but not exactly dressed either, being attended to by the store manager, who had supposedly left for the day hours ago. They didn't see me. I backed out immediately. I wrestled with what to do. Concerned for my career, I made an anonymous call to the security hotline, giving them vague details and telling them to contact me if they needed more. I'm certain they knew it was me. A few days later, the store manager was suspended. HR started interviewing staff. Me, the assistant store manager, and other PICs. We were told not to discuss it, but of course, we did. Turned out he had been sneaking in after hours to meet her, and she wasn't the first teenager he'd done this with at our store, or at others. He was fired. Like an idiot, he sued. Depositions were taken, NDAs were signed. Eventually, he backed off and dropped the lawsuit. As for the girl, she quit the moment he was suspended. Story 5. I signed an NDA after negotiating a six-figure settlement with my mortgage lender. Back in 2013, the bank illegally sold my home while I was living there and making monthly payments. I only found out when the so-called new owners showed up and evicted me and my 3 kids. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of identity theft or fraud. I spent the next 2 years fighting in court, drafting my own legal documents, and representing myself. Every reputable law firm I contacted either had conflicts of interest or flat out refused to take the case. Because as I later realized, the bank essentially owned them all. The first attorney I hired ran off with my last $7,000 before getting disbarred for misconduct in unrelated cases. I had no money, no home, but I did have a laptop, a printer, and access to the county court's law library. We were about a week away from jury selection when the bank finally caved and settled. The truth is, they weren't afraid of losing to me. They were afraid of the trial going public. If that happened, everyone would see the evidence proving they had lied, cheated, and manipulated the system to steal homes from hardworking people. If that got out, no one would trust them with new loans. In the end, the settlement was enough for each of my kids, now in their 20s, to get a reliable, inexpensive car, and for me to live at the beach. As for the name of the bank, I can't say, but let's just say it rhymes with case. Story 6. At the Fortune 500 company I work for, Buffett-style food from the cafeteria was supposed to be composted and logged as waste. That was the policy, but in reality, we were forced to reuse it. Health inspectors have strict rules. Any food that has been served buffet-style, left open for self-service, or exposed to potential contamination is considered unsafe and must be discarded. There are too many risks: cross-contamination, bacteria growth, unmonitored handling. That's why, if you can avoid it, you should never eat at a buffet. But the company didn't care about health codes, they cared about profits. Instead of tossing out leftover food, we were ordered to store it and repurpose it into soups, casseroles, or other dishes to serve again later. Some employees followed orders out of fear of losing their jobs. Others, like me, refused. I knew it was wrong. I wasn't about to serve people food that was technically garbage. So whenever my boss wasn't looking, I secretly threw it away. I got paid well and didn't want to get fired, but I also wasn't willing to compromise my morals. All employees had to sign NDAs prohibiting us from discussing food waste policies with the media or outsiders. Eventually, my boss caught on to what I was doing. We had it out. He confronted me, and I told him flat out that I would not serve garbage as food. In the end, we reached an agreement. I would quit. They could legally stop me from talking about it, but they couldn't force me to do something I knew was illegal, and I had made it clear. I was refusing. Story 7. I used to work in data analysis for revenue management at some big companies, and let me tell you, most of them have absolutely no clue about their own finances. I'm talking millions of dollars vanishing into thin air, and no one really knowing or even caring where it went. There were multiple times I had to inform clients that we had massive gaps in their cost data, numbers that were simply missing, and that we needed to track them down to make our final reports accurate. More often than not, the response was something along the lines of, "Just spread the missing costs over the existing ones. We just want the final total to be correct." That was all that mattered to them. As long as they ended the year with more money than they started with, nothing in between actually mattered. At first, I pushed back. I told my bosses that what we were doing wasn't right, that we were effectively fabricating data. They shrugged and told me to do whatever the client asked. After a while, I became disillusioned. When a client made a request that was mathematically or logically absurd, I stopped fighting it. I just did as they asked and left it up to their own analysts to figure out later that they had paid 6 figures for a completely meaningless analysis. The best part? I documented everything, every absurd request, every objection I raised that was ignored. And sure enough, months later, clients would sometimes come back, furious after their internal teams took a deep dive into the data and realized something was off. At that point, I would simply pull up the email trail proving that I had flagged the issue months earlier. My bosses, however, always caved to client demands, meaning we'd end up cleaning up the mess anyway. After a while, I came to a sobering realization. Most of our economy is held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. Maybe 10% of people working at big companies actually know what they're doing, and more often than not, they're not the ones in charge. Story 8. I used to work for a construction company in rural Texas, and the level of shady stuff we did was unreal. My boss was basically the Joe Exotic of construction, constantly screaming at us, calling us slurs, threatening to fight us. None of our haul trucks could pass a state inspection because he refused to fix them. He never paid taxes on any of the track hose, so whenever the tax man came around, we had to drive all the equipment deep into the woods and hide it. OSHA? Yeah, he had that covered by bribing the inspector. We knew our shops wouldn't pass inspection, so he just made sure no real inspection ever happened. Then there was the environmental nightmare. We had literal mountains of scrap metal dumped in the woods, stacks of old oil buckets rusting away in the open, an abandoned rail car filled to the brim with old oil, hydraulic fluid, and transmission fluid, uncapped, so whenever it rained, the toxic sludge overflowed right into the ground. And when we got new equipment, if it still had any oil or fluid in it, he'd tell us to just dump it into one of the ponds. Oh, and it wasn't just an environmental disaster, it was a legal one too. We constantly had random guys showing up to sell drugs right there at the shop. I worked there for 3 years. Looking back, I'm honestly shocked we were never raided or shut down. Story 9. Facebook moderators see things no one should ever have to see. Most people assume content moderation is some kind of cushy office job. In reality, moderators are exposed to some of the most horrific content imaginable. Things you'd expect to see in a war zone, not on a social media platform. One moderator told a story about watching a man get stabbed dozens of times, begging for his life. These kinds of scenes aren't rare. They happen constantly. And the worst part? Most moderators don't last long, but the things they see stick with them for life. Unlike full-time Facebook employees, moderators, hired through companies like Cognizant, don't get great pay or benefits. They're offered counseling while they're employed, but the moment they quit, they're on their own. No continued mental health support, no help processing the trauma, just a contract that bars them from talking about what they've seen. That's the final insult. The NDA. New hires think they're getting a simple desk job, then without warning, they're thrown into a nightmare. They can't talk about it. They can't warn anyone else. And by the time they realize what they've signed up for, it's already too late. Story 10. I used to work at a rundown zoo amusement park, and my job was running the roller coaster. Now, this wasn't some high-tech modern ride with an automatic stop-and-go system. No, this was a janky two-story kiddie coaster where the brakes were manual. If you weren't careful, you could seriously hurt someone. Only 2 people, myself included, were certified to train others on this ride because it was tricky to learn and even harder to operate safely. Enter Hotshot, a guy who had been working there for 3 months. He convinced our boss that he knew all the rides and should be a trainer. Our boss, being an idiot, agreed. So what does Hotshot do? He immediately puts a new girl, we'll call her Courtney, on the roller coaster and starts training her. Normally, it takes at least a week to learn the controls and a few extra days to get comfortable running the ride solo. I came in for my shift, and the first thing Hotshot did was walk up to me with a smug grin and say, "Guess who trained Courtney on the kiddie coaster?" I ran. By the time I got there, Courtney was losing her mind. Hotshot had loaded up the ride with passengers and then left her alone after just a few hours of training. She barely knew how to control the speed, let alone stop the coaster. Those poor people were stuck on the ride for 20 to 30 laps, when the usual number was 2. Customers were furious, threats of lawsuits started flying, and in the aftermath, I was forced to sign an NDA. For those wondering how it ended, I jumped onto the tracks, climbed into the control box, and stopped the ride for Courtney. She was traumatized and took the rest of the day off. And Hotshot, turns out the genius had dropped acid the night before work and still came in asking for a promotion. And our boss let him. Story 11. I used to work at a popular dog kennel, and let me just say, if people knew what really went on behind the scenes, they'd never leave their pets there. Dogs would be left for long periods, and some would stop eating altogether. Instead of telling the owners, the staff would just keep quiet. Owners would bring beds, favorite toys, and special treats, thinking their pets would get a little piece of home. None of it ever reached them. The beds and toys were tossed in trash bags and set aside. The treats thrown away. Management claimed it was for safety, that personal items made dogs aggressive or territorial. But honestly, they just didn't want to deal with the extra laundry. There wasn't much I could do. I had signed an NDA, so going public meant serious legal trouble. The most I could do was warn everyone I knew, do not bring your dog here. I told every pet owner I could, hoping word would spread. The worst part? Dogs trusted us. Even in awful conditions, they'd wag their tails and run up to the yard workers because they still found joy in small things. And yet, they had to live in cramped spaces, in a place that cared more about efficiency than actual care. To this day, whenever I drive past that place, I wonder if anything has changed. I hope it has, but I doubt it. Story 12. This wasn't under an official NDA, but I kept quiet for years to protect my job. For almost a decade, I worked for a major online retailer. They had outlet stores where they sold returned items and excess inventory at discounted prices. I started there and eventually became an assistant store manager. One day, my boss and I were out back by the dumpsters, dealing with our damage destroy pile, items that were too broken, expired, or otherwise unsellable. Everything had to be rendered unusable before it went in the bin, so sometimes we'd take out our frustrations smashing things up. Then we got to a retro-style record player. It had come in on a pallet of merchandise samples, but it wouldn't even turn on. I picked it up and slammed it to the ground. The front cracked slightly, and that's when I noticed something weird. A little piece of plastic sticking out. I looked closer. There was a bag inside the record player. We broke it open completely, and inside were 10 vacuum-sealed bags of marijuana. This was around 2008 or 2009, long before recreational weed was legal anywhere. There had to be at least a pound, maybe more. I asked my boss, "What the hell do we do?" "Write up a report. Call the cops." His answer? "Not a word. If corporate finds out, we'll have new rules, more oversight, and people could lose their jobs." Instead, he called a friend, a police officer, explained the situation, and arranged a meeting to turn it in. But first, we had to get it out of the store without raising suspicion. I grabbed an empty cookware box, stuffed the weed inside, put a price sticker on it, and carried it to the front. My boss met me at the register, and I rang him up like it was just another purchase. He later claimed that he handed the weed over to his cop friend, who thought the whole thing was hilarious. Looking back, though, I have my doubts. For all I know, my boss just kept it, or sold it. And honestly, I'll probably never know where it really came from, who was supposed to receive it, or how it even ended up in our store. Story 13. I used to work as an accountant, handling over 100 clients with just 3 other coworkers. The workload was insane, but what was really concerning was what we were actually being asked to do. In my country, companies are required to pay taxes on wages, covering things like health insurance, pension funds, and other contributions. These taxes are a set percentage, meaning the higher the salary, the higher the taxes. Most people here earn minimum wage, with the median wage only slightly higher. Now, your future pension depends on these contributions, not just whether you receive one, but also how much you get. Since we were responsible for calculating payroll, we were instructed to manipulate the numbers through a legal loophole that reduced these tax contributions. Employees would still receive their full paycheck, usually minimum wage, but the taxes paid toward their pensions were significantly lower. So instead of a future pension of around $200 for someone earning $300 a month, they'd only be entitled to around $120. Most employees had no idea this was happening because the tax calculations were so complex that the average person wouldn't catch it until it was too late. But that wasn't the only shady thing happening. We were also altering revenue and profit reports to reduce corporate taxes. And if that wasn't bad enough, we were forced to give legal advice despite not being qualified. I had taken a law class in management, which apparently made me the best person for the job. But in reality, I barely knew what I was doing. Oh, and we sold client data to their competitors if the price was right. I got out of there after just a few months. My coworkers followed a month later. No paycheck is worth going to jail because some business owners are too greedy to pay their fair share. Story 14. I did an internship at Disney World, where I learned that Disney has its own police, fire station, and hospital on the grounds, known as Reedy Creek. If something happens inside the park, whether it's a guest or employee getting injured or needing medical attention, cast members are required to call 911 from a Disney phone. This ensures that the call goes to Reedy Creek instead of the Orange County Police Department, keeping everything completely under Disney's control. If you don't have access to a Disney landline and have to use your personal cell phone, you're still expected to request a transfer to Reedy Creek instead of reporting the incident directly to Orange County authorities. I also heard, though this may just be a rumor, that Disney forbids anyone from being officially declared dead on park grounds. Instead, they'll record it as dead upon arrival at the hospital in official reports, regardless of where the person actually passed away. Story 15. Years ago, some phone carriers in the UK, Spain, and the US started offering a voicemail to text service, where voicemails would be automatically converted into text messages. Customers assumed this process was done by software. It wasn't. Instead, those private voicemails were sent to call centers in third world countries, including mine in the Dominican Republic, as well as others in India, where employees would manually listen to and type out every single message before sending it back as a text. Everything was under an NDA. We weren't allowed to have cell phones at work, and we were strictly prohibited from discussing our employer or the phone carriers involved. They even created a fake company name to hide who we were really working for, even though it was obvious from the messages that people were talking about major telecom providers. There was also a list of banned topics, things we weren't allowed to talk about at work. One of them, the company itself. Eventually, I did some digging. I found out that most of these phone carriers had a small clause buried in their terms of service stating that some messages might be used for software training. But in reality, they abused this loophole to outsource every single voicemail to human transcribers. At my call center alone, we had 300 employees working in 3 shifts to provide 24/7 coverage. That's how many private messages were being processed manually by strangers without customers ever knowing. Story 16. I once worked for a company that tracked Hollywood box office earnings. We had access to massive amounts of data, so much in fact that the studios started getting nervous. One day, they sent out NDAS to every single team to ensure we kept our mouths shut. But here's the thing. I was in the process of transferring teams on that exact day. As far as I know, I was the only employee who never had to sign an NDA. And that's how I can tell you this. The weekend Lilo and Stitch and Minority Report opened, Minority Report was officially reported as the top-grossing film. That was a lie. In reality, Minority Report earned slightly less than Lilo and Stitch, but 20th Century Fox couldn't allow a Tom Cruise sci-fi thriller to be outperformed by an animated Disney film. So a deal was struck between Fox and Disney, some kind of trade-off we never found out about. The official box office numbers were adjusted, and the world believed Minority Report won the weekend. It should also be noted that Steven Spielberg had just come off a disappointing box office performance with artificial intelligence. Another second-place opening might have been a serious blow to his career at the time. Story 17. The company I used to work for, Svensk Infrastructure, is the shadiest bunch of scumbags I've ever met. During my 2 weeks there, before they fired me and about 8 other people they had hired at the same time, I'm absolutely convinced to this day that they only hired us to get state funds for employing the unemployed. I witnessed multiple health and safety violations. They crammed over 50 people into a space meant for a maximum of 16. Bonus points for blocking the only fire escape with propane canisters and wooden tables. They even caused a power outage in an entire area by digging straight through a main power cable, among plenty of other questionable practices. The worst part? They're still doing the same shady stuff to this day. There are countless stories out there about how they take people's money for jobs they never finish, then vanish without a trace. To this day, I refuse to include them on my resume. I don't want to be associated with them in any way, shape, or form. Story 18. I volunteered as a Sunday school teacher for a couple of years before I eventually left the faith. I taught first grade, and one day a student asked to go to the restroom. Of course, when one kid has to go, they all do. After the restroom break, one child came up to me and said, "My pee-pee hurts." Following protocol, I immediately called my supervisor in case this was due to any form of abuse. My supervisor, in turn, contacted the police and the child's parents. The kid was gone for about 2 to 3 weeks. When he finally returned, his parents pulled me aside to explain what had happened. Apparently, he had put a small pencil inside himself, thinking that if he made the hole larger, he could pee faster and get back to class quicker. Unfortunately, the pencil got stuck, and he had to undergo surgery to remove part of it. After that incident, a new rule was put in place. All children had to empty their pockets before going to the restroom. I wasn't allowed to talk about it for 3 years because the church didn't want to risk looking bad or having anyone think that a staff member had harmed the child. Story 19. During my first graduate program in New York, I became really interested in a particular area of research because of a class I took. The professor teaching it was enthusiastic and I liked him. I wanted to join his lab, but there was an underlying tension between us, so we both knew it was a bad idea. When I say tension, I mean that we met several times a week to discuss research, and he would casually mention that he found me attractive. At the time, I was 21, and hearing that from an intelligent, successful, and equally attractive professor felt good. Looking back, it was definitely inappropriate. Despite that, I needed his help, either to get into his lab or to advocate for me with the department so I could transfer into another one. Unfortunately, my advisor was possessive and didn't want to let me switch labs. The professor didn't want to get involved, fearing that helping me would create resentment between him and my PI. One night, I went out for a drink with a friend at a bar near campus. I noticed the professor sitting nearby, but we both ignored each other. The next day, he filed a Title IX complaint, claiming that I was obsessed with him and had followed him to the bar. As it turned out, my PI had actually encouraged him to file the complaint to push me out of the program. To make things worse, my PI also accused me of being mentally unstable, citing an incident where I had supposedly hired 20 TAs for an experiment that only required 3. In reality, it was just a miscommunication. My PI's postdoc had told me to hire as many TAs as possible, so I hired 20. Apparently, the PI had only wanted 5 or so. The 3 of us had already met to fix the issue, and it hadn't been a big deal until they needed a reason to get rid of me. I wasn't allowed to talk about any of this at the time. In the end, I had to leave the PhD program with only a master's degree because of everything that happened. Story 20. I had a gay friend who was a bit flamboyant, not over the top, but he had a unique sense of style. He'd occasionally wear gladiator sandals, the kind that look like they belong in the Roman Colosseum, and sported a handlebar mustache. You'd think someone with such an eccentric personality would be open-minded, but he was actually incredibly prejudiced. It turns out his great-grandmother had lived in Nazi Germany and had been on that side of history. To give you an idea of what kind of person she was, when my friend's brother married a Jewish woman, his great-grandmother wore black to the wedding, claiming she was mourning the loss. Over time, as we heard more and more stories about her, we became increasingly curious. My friend would occasionally share details about her past, mentioning things like how she had witnessed events like the fall of the Berlin Wall. But he never really talked about her personal life. One night after a few drinks, my friend blurted out something shocking. His great-grandmother had apparently been a nuclear administrator for Hitler. I asked him if he was ever worried that she'd be found out. He just shrugged and said she had burned her own files. I can't verify how true the story is since I only heard it second or third hand, but there are definitely some wild people out there. Story 21. I had a 7-year requirement to keep anything NATO-related from my tour in Bosnia confidential. I wasn't even supposed to discuss it with other military members who weren't directly involved. Most of the classified material was common-sense secrecy. Top secret details like personnel numbers, locations, equipment types, and ammunition. Some of it was mission-related and had to remain undisclosed for operational security. We couldn't exactly tip off war criminals that we were coming to serve warrants. My duties required regular interaction with the command post, so I was in and out of there multiple times a day. This was where SFOR, I4, NATO, and the United Nations coordinated efforts. Naturally, everything up there was classified at a minimum of secret. Since flat panel monitors weren't a thing yet, they relied heavily on whiteboards to track information that changed hourly or daily. One of the things they tracked was landmine incidents. I never saw that number stay the same between my visits. Keeping a mental count, I estimated that the longest stretch without an incident was 36 hours. No matter how much money was spent, how many top-tier experts and combat engineers were brought in, and we had some of the best in the world, or how many detection and prevention measures were put in place, we couldn't make a dent in the problem. The worst part, many of these incidents involved children, kids just looking for a place to kick a soccer ball or trying to take a shortcut through a small wooded area between their home and the corner store. When I first joined the USAF, I was trained as a Serbian-Croatian cryptolinguist. I've been deployed to combat and non-combat situations all over the world, but the landmine issue has always stuck with me. It was senseless. It never should have happened. And I'm grateful I played a role in bringing those responsible to justice. It's one of the few times I've been completely convinced that the United States was objectively on the right side of history. Story 22. It wasn't technically an NDA, but I probably would have been fired if I had told customers the truth about what they were eating. And trust me, I felt awful about it. Turtle Bay, UK proudly advertises freshly cooked, high-quality dishes, but in reality, everything comes pre-prepped in frozen food bags, microwaved for a minute, and then served. I learned quickly that my safest option for lunch was an off-menu cheese sandwich. At least that was made fresh, and it's pretty hard to mess up a cheese sandwich. The company also falsely marketed red wine as vegan, even though the production process involved fish bladders. That policy thankfully changed after a vegan customer read the ingredients and complained. This led to me once again reiterating how ridiculous the company's standards were. To add to the absurdity, one of the owners decided to remove all dairy milk and replace it with only coconut milk to make the bar vegan-friendly. Meanwhile, they continued to serve whole chickens on the menu. I don't know about you, but I like my piña coladas with actual milk. Having a coconut option would have been nice, but banning dairy completely while still serving meat makes no sense. They also market themselves as the Turtle Bay family, but I can't think of anything more hypocritical. Even 2 years later, I can still smell the bullshit. Story 23. I worked for a software company that treated me like garbage the entire time I was there. They dangled raises and promotions in front of me, promising them if I hit certain goals, only to renege every time I met them. Frustrated, I quit in protest. Immediately after, I was approached by a company that was in the process of being courted for acquisition by my former employer. My ex-company had lowballed them, offering a pittance. So the targeted company hired me confidentially as a special consultant, and I helped them maximize their valuation, steering them away from my previous employer. Instead, I helped them sell to my ex-company's biggest competitor for a much higher price. In the end, I helped a small business secure a far better deal, while also costing my former employer millions. They had spent years screwing me out of about $10,000 per year in salary. But in the end, their greed and dishonesty likely cost them millions. Story 24. You can buy your way onto those best insert profession, school business lists. Best doctors, best dentists, best lawyers, best business schools, best hotels, and so on. I know this because I worked for one of the publications. It was a complete joke. If your town has a best of contest with categories like best BBQ, best first date spot, best local band, you should know that many of the business-related winners paid for their spots. I used to work for a publication that didn't engage in this practice. I personally tracked the votes, checked IP addresses for manipulation, and ensured the results were legitimate. But a competing publication did sell the top spots, and advertisers would get furious when they lost, often demanding how much to win. Once, when I emailed winners their congratulatory messages, I got a "go if yourself" in response from one of my own advertising clients because they didn't win in their category. I had to send a professional reply. "I'm so sorry the results weren't in your favor, but of course, I think your restaurant is amazing. Let's talk about other ways to raise your profile. How does Thursday sound?" His response? He immediately pulled all advertising and refused to take my calls. He was suddenly never in whenever I stopped by. To prove the results were fair, I even dropped off a PDF of every vote cast with identifiers removed, but he never responded. His restaurant closed within a year. To be honest, he overestimated his audience. He kept branding his place as a Manhattan-style white tablecloth restaurant, charging a la carte pricing, $25 for a steak, plus an extra $5 to $9 for a salad, plus separate pricing for sides. The problem? This was a budget-conscious, conservative, mid-sized southern town where people cared more about new trucks and lake houses than upscale dining experiences. He didn't close because his food was bad. He closed because he didn't understand his market. He thought he was giving people something they didn't even know they wanted. Turns out they didn't want it at all. Story 25. In Belgium, the entire city of Antwerp was declared a low-emission zone, and emission scanning cameras were placed all around the city. In reality, this is a scheme to conduct license plate data mining to combat drug trafficking. It is physically impossible to drive in or out of Antwerp without being tagged. If you enter and exit, your times, frequency, and license plate are logged. This data is then used to determine the supposed owner of the car. If a certain vehicle stays in one location for an extended period, it is flagged based on a multitude of variables. The police dispatch isn't even involved in this process. When officers make their rounds, they have a monitor that alerts them in real time if a flagged vehicle is in the area. Suspicious license plates pop up automatically, allowing police to take action immediately. Some police executives have stated that they don't fully approve of this system, but politicians dictate what the police force should focus on. Currently, their priority is almost entirely on enforcing social distancing and lockdown rules. Last year, efforts to combat theft and burglary were reduced to allocate more resources to tackling drug users, as well as dealers. Shockingly, there was a 13% increase in efforts focused on drug users, compared to just 6% toward dealers. It's frustrating to see tax money wasted on a senseless war on drugs, with a heavy emphasis on targeting users. At first, the whole low-emission zone scheme sounded like a conspiracy theory to me, until I saw it in action. It's disheartening, to say the least. On top of that, 1 in 5 officers on the force is reportedly corrupt, taking dirty money to pass along information or look the other way. You never knew which colleague you could trust. Despite this, there are still many good people in the Antwerp police force who are forced to work alongside criminals. I can only hope that things change for the better, and that Antwerp abandons its misguided war on drugs. Story 26. I signed this NDA back in 2017, so I'm hoping it's void by now. One night I got drunk and ended up at a famous celebrity's house in Calabasas. The Uber pulled up to a massive gated community where security stopped us and required everyone to sign NDAs before we could enter. We signed. Fast forward a bit, we arrived at this incredible house, stepped inside, and there were owls everywhere. Stuffed owls, figurines, paintings, mugs, plates. Even the bathroom hand towels had owl designs. And right in the middle of the den stood a massive taxidermied tiger. We partied for a while, got drunk, and had a good time. There was staff inside the house and outside by the pool. Chefs were grilling food for anyone who wanted something to eat. Around 4 a.m., I started feeling exhausted. I knew getting a ride home would be expensive, but I opened my Uber app anyway, only to realize I had no service. Turns out the celebrity and their neighbors have a signal-blocking tower that kills cell service to prevent guests from taking and uploading photos or videos. I had to ask for a Wi-Fi password for over 2 hours before someone finally relented and gave it to me. The place was incredible, but I was so annoyed that it was nearly impossible to get a ride home. So, as a bit of revenge, I grabbed a blanket from one of the living rooms and walked out with it. I still have it to this day. When I left for law school, I passed it on to my younger brother. He's a much bigger fan of this celebrity than I am. Story 27. The University of the Pacific, Dugoni School of Dentistry, engaged in, or at the very least allowed, over a decade of human research without IRB approval. Two so-called doctors, a husband and wife, with connections to Rotoplast International traveled the world, misleading impoverished and uneducated families into giving their blood under unsanitary conditions for their so-called research. Here's the worst part. Their research was complete garbage. It was unpublishable and served no real scientific purpose. Instead, they used it as an excuse to run a fellowship program that charged students $60,000 per year under the false pretense that it would help them get published and develop research skills, neither of which actually happened. It was a complete scam. These two doctors don't even have the credentials to call themselves that. They wear lab coats embroidered with MD, despite not being medical doctors. They claim they were MDs in Eastern Europe decades ago, but they have no U.S. credentials. Yet they exploited their white coats to play doctor on these mission trips. On at least one of these missions, they allegedly disrobed children, an absolutely horrifying act. If there's a way for me to upload a redacted IRB complaint, let me know. To make matters worse, after all of this was brought to the attention of Dean Nader Shahi, almost nothing was done. The fellowship program was shut down, but none of the students were refunded. Meanwhile, those two doctors are still there, still wearing their lab coats, still misleading students, and still going on mission trips. It's a disgrace. That place is corrupt to its core. Story 28. Back in the 2000s, about 30% of the U.S. economy relied on a single building just north of Kansas City, Missouri. This largely nondescript structure, roughly the size of a city block, hosted the servers for Visa. By contract, the site required 24/7 security and armed staff to protect Visa servers at all times. However, there was a loophole. The contracts never specified that security personnel needed experience, nor did they prohibit overlap between roles. They also didn't clarify what armed meant, nor did they require staff to remain awake while on duty. So, say hello to the person who was responsible for guarding your financial data, both physically and digitally, alone in the middle of the night, struggling to stay awake for 80-hour work weeks. My only qualifications? A fresh out-of-college computer science degree and a heavy mag light. Every night, it was just me, my flashlight, and my still-developing technical knowledge standing between a potential intruder and a score that would make a bank heist look like pocket change. Chinese hackers were a constant threat. Fortunately, they never discovered our location. I might have been able to fend off a single burly thief, but an actual trained team? No chance. One night, there actually was a break-in. Turned out to be just a homeless guy looking for a place to sleep. After I left, the business shut down, and VISA moved its servers elsewhere. That job was a tad stressful. Story 29. The TSA is a joke. When I was stationed in Baton Rouge, we Marines were occasionally asked to test their security. One time, another Marine and I were assigned to test a TSA checkpoint. The supervisor gave us fake bomb materials and 30 minutes in a room full of random bags and travel items to devise a plan to get past security. Nothing was prearranged, so even the supervisor didn't know how we would attempt to smuggle the materials through. We were issued boarding passes like regular passengers, dropped off at the airport, and observed from afar. My friend and I successfully got date cord, sheets of plastic explosives, and other materials past security, just by talking our way through. The agents questioning me at the table knew they were being tested. They asked why I had so little clothing, why I was carrying an old camera from the 1980s, and even why I didn't pack a toothbrush. That last one felt oddly specific. I confidently bullshit my answers, and they let me through with barely any pushback. I had the materials needed to set off the explosives, while my buddy, further back in line, had the actual explosives. They ran our bags through the X-ray, conducted a physical search, and still missed everything. We made it all the way to the gate without a problem. The manager was furious and made us go through the test again. This time, TSA caught us because the manager tipped them off. Story 30. This is based on some of my research. Research that doesn't technically violate any NDAs. But I've been warned to stay quiet for the sake of my future and goodwill. The regional dynamics of the ongoing conflict in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, are far more complex than most realize. Over 40 major rebel groups operate in the DRC, many of which were originally backed by neighboring countries during the Second Congo War. In the early 2010s, one particular group grew large enough to cause widespread chaos, death, and economic devastation. While the UN blamed the usual suspects, the reality was far more complicated. I received classified intelligence from regional sources detailing how different actors were involved, some in ways that contradicted official narratives. One country in particular was actively working to stop the rebel group, even with the involvement of some high-ranking military officials. When I was preparing to write about it, I received warnings, messages that were vague yet direct. They said they were disappointed and advised me not to continue. For the sake of my future, they urged me to drop it. It was unsettling, but I wasn't surprised. I've had informants arrested for political and personal reasons before. Some stories are just too dangerous to tell. Story 31. This isn't my story, but my grandfather's. He was a young man in the Air Force back in the late 1950s. Officially, his job was serving on weather planes. What nobody knew, not even my grandmother at first, was that he had an exceptional understanding of radiation. He was part of one of the first radiation sniffer plane missions. His role was to collect and organize incoming data from the instruments, some of which he had helped design. His entire mission revolved around tracking radiation clouds from Nagasaki and Hiroshima to study their effects on weather and the environment. When his contract ended, he was offered a promotion and a pay raise, but he declined. He wanted to pursue his dreams elsewhere. To this day, he jokingly talks about the time the U.S. government attempted to bribe him, but he also says that the data he collected disturbed him deeply, that it was never good news. I believe he left because he was shaken by what he saw, and because the government he had once been loyal to tried to cover it up by buying off everyone involved. Story 32. I worked for several mobile game companies, and now that I'm finally free of NDAs, I can talk about it. This should be obvious, but people still find it shocking. Every major mobile and free-to-play F2P game cheats when it comes to random results. They manipulate the numbers to maximize profits. There is no fairness. None. Win-loss rates, drop rates, none of it is truly random. If reducing your stats on the back end makes you more likely to spend money, they'll do it. If A/B testing shows that making a player temporarily win more after a purchase increases the likelihood of them spending again, they'll rig the system accordingly. There is no actual chance involved, only a carefully calculated algorithm designed to extract as much money as possible. It goes even deeper. Some companies program their games to let players perform better right after making a microtransaction, then slowly degrade their performance, simulating the same chemical response as a drug hit. They don't just want you spending money, they want you addicted to hitting that $99.99 buy now button. And this is all in addition to the visible scams. Unlike gambling, there are almost no regulations in most countries unless it specifically targets children. Japan is one of the only places that banned the original Kampugacha system, which preyed on the sunk cost fallacy. But make no mistake, every major mobile game company does this. Every single one. It's an industry standard. Story 33. The products sold to the U.S. Armed Forces, across all divisions, failed product testing. An engineer refused to falsify the results, so he was fired. The products were supposed to be built according to strict government specifications, with no variations. But in reality, we had two sets of plans, one for the government inspectors and one for the shop. The reason? We couldn't source certain parts. Some of our so-called new innovations were just competitors' products shoved into different casings with useless features slapped on. We straight up copied items from other companies and rebuilt them with cheaper materials. The workplace itself was a nightmare, both figuratively and literally. They cut beryllium and tellurium copper on a laser without a fume hood, exposing workers to toxic fumes. The owner sourced materials from 3 different companies and played a revolving door game with payments. delaying invoices until he was eventually sent to collections. The company marketed itself as Made in America, but in reality, it was just assembled in America by undocumented workers who had no way of reporting OSHA violations without risking deportation. I heard lawyers eventually got involved, and there were major legal issues. But last I checked, their website is still up. Honestly, it was such a terrible experience working there that I'm just happy to put it behind me. Story 34. When I was a kid, we lived in Nevada, stationed at Nellis AFB. My dad went to work every day and came home every evening. Nothing ever seemed unusual, until one day when my parents had an intense conversation that escalated quickly. I remember my mom being in shock, her excitement turning into disbelief. I asked what was going on, and they gave me a simple answer. I remember thinking, so what? Daddy works on airplanes. We already know that. What had caused all the commotion? A series of UFO sightings over Nevada that had gained so much attention, the government decided to go public about them. Turns out, the UFO in question was the B-2 stealth bomber, and my dad was a key flight crew member. For over a year, he had been going to work, flying to different locations, sometimes in other states, and returning home without anyone being the wiser. That day, the government had briefed them on what information would be declassified. My dad came home and told my mom before she saw it on TV, and she flipped out with excitement. Even now, years later, there are still things he won't tell us about those 4 years. Story 35. I never signed an NDA, but even if I had, I wouldn't have been able to report what I saw. I worked as a nail technician at a local nail spa. I was the only Caucasian employee. Everyone else was Chinese. I was working in one of the few states that required the maximum number of training hours to get licensed, and I worked my ass off for mine. But when I got hired, I was never asked to show my license. I was allowed to work on clients without my boss even verifying that I was legally qualified to do so. That's highly illegal. The barbicide, the solution used to sanitize tools, was disgusting, grimy and dirty, with a layer of oils and debris settled at the bottom of the container. I went looking for fresh solution, but when my boss walked in, I showed her the grime. She shrugged and said, "It's fine. It still works. Besides, we use a sterilizing machine." The problem? In my state, using a sterilizing machine is worthless if the barbicide isn't properly maintained. I tried explaining this to her. My school had even provided us with a copy of the full state regulations. I showed her, and she just shoved it away, saying, "That's not how it works in the real world." She was so condescending. I didn't want trouble with her or the state board, so I started panicking. If the board found out, I could lose my license. She saw me having a panic attack and tried to cut my hours. 2 days later, I quit. I attempted to report them to the state board, but they wouldn't let me do it anonymously. To proceed with an investigation, I would have to allow my license to be suspended, with no guarantee of how long the process would take. I couldn't afford to be out of work, so I found a job at a daycare instead. A week later, I tried to file my report again. This time, it was denied because I had waited too long. I contacted OSHA, told them everything. They said it was out of their jurisdiction, and that since I had quit, I could no longer file a formal grievance. So now I just call them out everywhere. I flamed them on social media and spread the word about how disgusting they were. By the way, the salon's name is Chai Nail Spa in Bozeman, Montana. Avoid it unless you want to end up with MRC. Story 36. I was under an NDA for a major movie. As a core extra, I was booked for 4 to 6 weeks on set. The budget was between $150 to $200 million, and it had a cast full of well-known, respected actors. The production company itself had been around since World War II. I fully expected to sign an NDA. That was nothing new. I had done it before. But this NDA, this one was different. It contained all the usual clauses. No discussing the storyline, no talking about the lead actors until the release date, no taking photos, videos, or posting on social media. That was standard. Then I got to the weird part. The NDA explicitly forbade us from mentioning any illegal drug use or prescription drug abuse we might witness on set. It also stated that we could not discuss gambling or knowledge of anyone with a gambling addiction. There had been rumors about one of the lead actors having a gambling problem. I had never believed them until I read the NDA. But it went even further. We were not allowed to talk about any romantic or sexual relationships between cast or crew members. Whether it was between actors, extras, or even the craft services team, if we saw anything, we had to keep quiet. The whole thing made me wonder, This was a PG-13 movie. What the hell was happening behind the scenes? I never personally saw any drug use, gambling, or inappropriate behavior, but years later that NDA still lingers in my mind. Story 37. I worked as a thermal engineer for a startup that was developing a hybrid thermal energy refrigeration system for long-haul truckers. The idea was solid: use waste heat from truck exhaust to power a refrigeration system, which would then store the cold for when the driver needed to sleep at night. The system was virtually silent during sleep mode and had real potential as an innovative, green technology for investors and trucking fleets. From an engineering standpoint, it wasn't a scam. It was a legitimate adaptation of ancient thermal technology. Think back to the future the third ice cubes. But the company's president? He was a liar. He was the one shaking down investors, constantly lying about the unit's performance. We engineered the absolute hell out of that system, but we could never meet his fake performance claims. The size and weight limitations made it impossible. For example, in perfect conditions, our system could generate about 750 watts of cooling power. But in Arizona's 48 degrees Celsius, 118 degrees Fahrenheit heat, the system would barely function. The president, he was out there promising investors 5,000 watts of cooling power in extreme conditions. Over an 8-year period, he managed to con investors out of $9 million. The company finally collapsed 6 months ago. I left 3 years before that, when I saw the writing on the wall. The worst part? His lies tarnished the reputation of legitimate green tech startups. Suppliers and component vendors got burned when payments stopped coming in, and when investments dried up, the whole operation crumbled. What really pissed me off was knowing how hard it is for actual small business owners to get funding for product development. And here was this crook, pocketing tax-funded Canadian government grants for scientific research, money that came from hardworking citizens, by falsifying test data outside of our knowledge. If you have any technical questions, feel free to ask. My fellow engineers and I were incredibly proud of what we built, even if the market couldn't support it as is. But the lies, the false promises, and the impossible demands made the entire thing feel like a betrayal. We were being pushed beyond the realms of physics, and physics always wins. Story 38. When I was a teenager, my dad and I accidentally uncovered a large money laundering operation. My dad used to get his work uniforms delivered by a company once a week. One day he received the wrong set of uniforms and called the company to let them know. The moment he mentioned the name on the shirt, they immediately told him to stop touching the clothing and seal it back up. Turns out they were literally laundering drug money, hiding cash in the clothes and then washing them to transport it undetected. When the operation was busted, we were called to serve as witnesses. My dad had to testify in court, but I didn't. A while later, 2 lawyers showed up at our house with a pile of documents for us to sign. Since I was still a minor, I couldn't legally sign an NDA, but they had me sign an affidavit affirming that what I had previously told authorities was true. They told me that because my affidavit would be included in the case file, it would be bound by the same rules as the NDA. I've always enjoyed finding ways to slip things past people, so I signed it under the name Powdered Toast Man, a Ren and Stimpy character, but made it look like a real signature. Somewhere out there, I'd like to think that document is still sitting in an important case file, signed by a cartoon superhero. Story 39. I used to work at a cell phone provider in Bermuda. We sold unlocked cell phones, meaning they could work with any SIM card. Whenever a Bermudian or local resident traveled overseas, their roaming charges could easily cost them thousands of dollars. We were forbidden from telling customers that they could simply buy a prepaid SIM card in the country they were visiting and use it in their phone. If they figured it out on their own, great. But if we ever suggested it, we could be fired on the spot. There was no NDA, but management made it very clear that discussing alternatives to roaming fees would result in termination. Many people had no idea. They returned home to insane phone bills. The highest roaming bill I ever saw? $10,000. A customer had gone to Canada and left their roaming data on, with automatic iPhone updates running in the background. This was back in 2007 or 2008, before data caps were common. For reference, 1 Bermuda dollar equals 1 US dollar, so that bill was as bad as it sounds. I'm no longer in telecommunications, and honestly, I'm glad.